on the WRD YouTube channel. So welcome everyone. My name is Robin Harkless. I'm with Oregon Consensus, and I just want to welcome everybody to our House Bill 5006 work group. We're still letting a few folks in. So as we're getting settled, if you have not yet as a work group member, just add on your representation to the back of, to the end of your name on your profile, so we can all kind of see who's who, as we're still, for some, getting to know each other. And if you have the ability to show video, we'd love to see people's faces, recognizing that might not be possible for everyone today. But if it is possible, we'd love to see you and kind of bring the work group into the room together as best as we can over this lovely Zoom virtual platform. So I think just to kick things off, I want to just acknowledge on the heels of our last work group meeting, which was in April, that there were questions, continuing questions about sort of what the charge and scope of this group is, and recognizing that, you know, for some, really kind of getting a better sense of that will help you then get into the conversations a little bit more fully. So in order to support you all in that, our team, working with WRD staff, our Oregon Consensus team, and then passing this through the coordinating committee, we tried to take an organizing framework. It's not an end-all be-all, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's just a way for us to start to anchor down into some pieces of what this big question of state-supported regional water planning and management system should look like. And so what we did was pulled from a lot of past iterative processes, initiatives, and forming documents to try to cull, like, what are some of the big elements that seem to continue to persist in these conversations around what's important for the system. And in particular, as we're looking at sort of what the regional kind of planning, project development and implementation part of it looks like. So we did that. That's an organizing feature for you all. Send it out in an email with the materials, and we will go through that today and talk a little bit about that. And at the outset, we just wanted to invite back in the legislative leaders who helped to kind of champion this effort and really kind of helped at the early stage try to get this thing launched. So I know we have the representatives here. I know for sure, Mark, you wanted to say a few words. I'm not sure if the others did, but I'd love to just give you an opportunity to say a couple words about how you might frame this up for the group again.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. And thanks all. Sorry I missed last month, but I did go back through technology and watch it and listen. There's some communities that are having some success, some communities that are struggling, but it seems like there's still an uncoordinated approach throughout the state. So I'll just spend a few minutes talking about what I hope and desire for this group. I've been involved with place-based planning since it was pretty much authorized in 2014. Been a champion of that effort, been co-convening that effort in Harney Basin. There was 4 chosen communities that were able to work through that process. Has it been painless? No. Has it been productive? Most times. Has the state been set up with a framework in order to support those communities to go through those conversations? I would say no. Loosely, yes. But to get an outcome within a measured amount of time that could be supported, now we're not there. So why did we bring this group together? Well, place-based planning sunsets this next year. Do we as a state have a path forward? We don't. Is the department going to hold a meeting on May 10th to talk about what they feel a policy option package should be for regional planning? Yeah, they are. Is my office working with Rep. Helm and Rep. Bearden? Can we come up with a backstop for that? Can we come up with a process how we want to support communities in planning? We probably could. We could probably bring it forward even as a committee bill, get beat up by lobbyists. Some of the lobbyists that are here might be successful, might not. But will we get the voices of everybody that's in this room? We won't. Do I have a desire to pull from everybody that's been invited to this table and those that have not in order to figure out how the state can set up a framework to support community conversations? I do. Do I believe that communities need to understand and have the knowledge whether they can meet their water need now? Can they meet their water need in the future? I do. Is the state set up in order to do that in the next 4 to 6 years? No. Is that the Water Resource Department's fault? Tom's fault? No. Is that my fault as a legislator if I don't try to figure out how to bring minds smarter than mine to come together to get this framework? Yes. So I am selfishly asking you to come together, figure out what is it? What is it that individual communities, not putting a definition on communities, need to understand if they can meet their water challenges? How they can put something down on paper to figure out what they do in drought, what they do if they can't meet their demand, what data they need, what information they need, what framework that we could bring forth through the legislative process to support the department, support OWEB, support ODF and W. I don't care who we support. Well, what I want to support is your communities that you live in. One size fits all approach to water is not there. And I challenge you, put something out there. Otherwise, Ken, Jeff, and I will, the department will. It's not going to be the product that we want. I can ramble on and on, but I think I know where you're going. We brought you together to give you the ability to help us because we're struggling to try to figure this out. We need a coordinated approach. It doesn't have to have a lot of meat on the bones, but we want to know how we put state investments out there to support communities. Robin, I think I said enough.
Thanks so much. Rep Helm, I see you. Do you want to say a few words?
Well, first, I'll just support everything that Mark just said. He's been on the ground living it, and many of you have too. I want to do a couple of things. I want to remind you all again what a unique opportunity this is. You're the best minds on water in the state. And you're the most diverse group that we've ever pulled together on to try to solve some water issues. So don't blow that chance, please. Figure out a way to move forward. Get everybody caught up so that you're on the same page and tackle some of the biggest historical problems that we've had with water. Please do that. The other thing I'll note is this. We're now facing a second year of extreme drought for the entire state. This is a long-term trend, as many of you know. I know that many of you are watching the updates.
I mean, I suspect that.
And Nikki, your microphone's on. So I know that you're following this closely, but let's make the following assumption. This is the way it's going to be for the next 20 years. And I don't see any way around that. And the world economy is changing for the worse and will be, I think, worse for the next 5-6 years because of the war in Europe. That's going to put completely new pressures on our state. In particular, how we protect our economy. And in doing that, we have to protect our agricultural resources like never before. And at the same time, we cannot let our fish and wildlife slip further toward extinction. So it's a big challenge, but there is more water out there to share. And we're on the cusp of needing to share it and needing to allow the department through group agreement, some easier ways to help folks do that. And we're not going to get there by retrenching to old ideas and old battle lines. So please put all that to the side and put your big brains on this problem and bring us something like Mark said. Thanks.
And I won't even try to add to either one of those messages, except just say I was just so proud to be serving with these two folks and looking forward to what you come up with. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And also want to appreciate the coordinating committee and the WRD staff who did some attempting, like I said, of just trying to get some organizing framework around this behemoth challenge in front of you all. Holly has graciously offered to say a couple words about just what the coordinating committee helped review for today's conversation, and all sort of in the vein of like trying to help set you all up for some focused conversations moving forward. We heard that request, so we responded in kind. So Holly, I'm going to give the floor to you.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, everyone. Good morning. As Robin said, I'm Holly Mondo. I'm the project manager for the Harney Community-Based Water Planning Collaborative out in Eastern Oregon. And the coordinating committee this last week discussed lots of things to kind of structure the agenda for today's call. The first thing we talked about was these essential elements of planning approaches. So we're trying to bring together all these different elements from all the various planning platforms that have existed before this one to really, all these different planning processes happened in kind of like silos, like the IWRM, 100-year water vision, and of course, all the planning groups that we've heard from last time. So really trying to bring all those to the forefront and figure out what gaps exist so that our planning process is very streamlined and is connected with what has been learned from all these other processes. So we want the working group today to confirm that those essential elements are correct and will provide this working group with a foundational platform for our planning process. As I said before, these essential elements have been articulated from past forums and past work and product iterations, as well as what we've heard from the working group to date. In our meeting today, we also want to focus on which of these elements need to be more clearly defined. So we've offered some definitions of these elements, but some of them we're really unclear on in terms of how this working group can work on those elements. And this will be made a lot clearer once we dive into the agenda. We also looked over a proposed timeline for the work group, which Robin will touch on later in our agenda. And then lastly, talked about how we can foster an ongoing learning process with this group. So we discussed an intention to provide opportunities in between meetings to continue these learning spaces where people can dive into these topics, these broader topics, and get a little bit more detailed. And then those in between meetings would be recorded so people can either tune into those while they're happening or revisit them at their leisure. I don't think I missed anything, Robin, but let me know if I did, or other coordinating committee members, let me know if I missed anything.
Yeah, any other coordinating committee members want to add anything to how this agenda is being scoped for today? All right, so in a moment, we will turn to Tom to give us some kind of broader updates about what's going on in the world of water, but also we'll invite you, Tom, to speak a little bit about what your observations are for opportunity that exists for this work group to do its work. Shy of that, we do need to just do a couple housekeeping things. We sent out our April 5th meeting summaries and received some feedback, comments, and edits. And so we sent an updated version of those notes back out to the group yesterday. So I just wanted to give one last opportunity for work group members to offer any final edits to that before we kind of consider those approved. I see a hand, Marianne.
Robin, I apologize. I reviewed them when they came out, but I did not notice that you had sent out a revised version. Can we maybe hold on approving those until I've had a chance to glance at it?
Okay.
And I can do that in the course of the meeting. I just, having no idea what the nature of the changes are, I feel a little weird approving it.
Yeah, that's totally understandable. We'll give the group a couple more days to send us any final edits and we'll send those back out. The nature of the changes, just for your awareness, were more technical from the technical presentations. We invited those presenters to make sure that we captured accurately what they had presented on. And so it was really, all the edits were kind of in that vein. But we'll give you an opportunity to see that. And
If that's the case, Rob, I'm comfortable. I didn't know if there were more than that. So I'm good either way.
okay. Any other comments on the notes? And just a reminder that also there was some supplemental information that was passed along to you from each of those planning groups that presented last time. So the supplemental information is also supposed to be for your reference and referral in this space. And so we didn't capture all of that detail in the notes where that should be captured in those one-pagers that staff helped to develop in kind of in consult with the presenters. Yeah, Mary Ann.
And I apologize. This is just kind of maybe an ongoing process thing. I'll make it easier for next time. I was just like, man, how did I miss that? And I didn't miss it. I did look at the email. It just wasn't indicated anywhere that that was updated. And then when you open it, you can't see what the changes were.
Oh,
Can
okay.
you in future emails like indicate it's been updated and maybe do a red line of what the changes are? So like,
Yeah.
for me having already reviewed 3 or 4 pages at once, like you'd have to reread the whole thing and like basically re-review it again. And that's be just easier if it was redlined.
Yeah, can do. April?
I think just since we're kind of in that logistical vein, yeah, if the future stuff, it could be indicated which of the materials are updated. Because I was kind of in the same boat. I printed out the minutes from last week's meeting and all those materials, and then we got the additional email. And so just some differentiation between what's new and what's not new. And then I would also request that for the meetings that we're doing virtually or where there's a virtual component, if the calendar invite could actually have the meeting link, that would be greatly helpful, because that's where I always go. And then I have to go back and find what the email with the link in there, if that makes sense. I'm seeing head nods, so at least it makes sense to some other folks.
Yeah, I think I think it is in there, but we'll double check on that, April, for you. There should be a Zoom link for each of the work group members in your calendar invite, but we'll double check that that's true. Kate's got a thumbs up. Peggy?
And so just really quickly, so I get the, I don't get the calendar invite on my computer, and I don't know whether that's a software issue or whatever. But I did find that it was on my smartphone.
Okay. Well, we'll do some troubleshooting on this piece outside of the meeting today and just make sure that we have some clear instructions for how to make sure you have the link in your calendar invitation. And then if anybody's not receiving those, to let us know. So Peggy will try to troubleshoot that with you. Okay. All right. So we will resend the redlined version of the updated notes. We will be clearer about which materials have been updated. We tend to add a date stamp to those things, but we'll be really clear next time if it's an updated version of the material, just to help ease the tracking for each of you, because there's a lot. And we really sincerely hope that you are in earnest looking at our emails and reviewing the materials as part of being prepared for these meetings. It's not just kind of fluff that we're sending out to you. We're actually trying to help funnel you into a constructive, productive space in these calls. So yeah, to the extent that it's, we need to better help you track those things. We're all about it. So appreciate the helpful suggestions there. All right, so moving on, just a quick review of today's agenda before I turn it over to Tom. So we will hear some updates from OWRD. We will talk a little bit, we'll allow some Q&A for you to kind of chat with Tom about some of the other processes, and even to talk a little bit about what you're hearing in terms of the ask and the hope from the leadership before you. And then we're going to hear from Tribal Perspectives panel today. So we've been working with the folks who are representing tribes that are sitting on this work group, who will be speaking to you about that. And we'll tee that up a little better right before then. Then we'll go into a break, and in the afternoon portion, we're going to engage you in some conversations around that set of elements, and we'll kind of target a specific piece that will invite you to talk with each other about. And just a forewarning for everyone out there, we are going to be going into some small groups, which will be breakout groups. So there will be a little bit of downtime for those that are watching via the live stream, but it won't be a super long time. And we will make sure there's time for each group to come back and do a report out, so that there's real kind of, everyone can kind of hear what some of those conversations are. But the intention really is to respond to the other requests that we heard from you all, which is we're ready to get into some discussions with each other. And one of the ways to do that is to help to kind of break you into smaller groups and really invite you into a little more intimate conversations with each other, with the promise that it comes back into the public sphere as a report out. So there's no decisions being made. There's no proposals being developed today. It's really exploratory in nature. And we're hoping that this then is a nice setup for what happens in June, which is an in-person meeting in Central Oregon. And we'll have some more detail to share with you at the end of today about that meeting coming up. So really appreciate you kind of leaning in today with curiosity, looking to maybe learn something new, but also looking to share something that's really important to you and the interests that you're bringing to this conversation. I think people want to hear both of those things. So I'm really hoping that this is a chance for people to really start leaning in with each other. And I mean, all of you on the work group. Marianne.
I don't care either way, Robin. I just want the information. Are the breakout sessions recorded, or are they not recorded as part of the overall process?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have the ability to record those, I don't think. So if we can, we'll try to make that happen. But if we can't, it's just a compromise, I think a trade-off that we're going to have to make for a few minutes today. So we understand you want to hear from everybody. But again, the trade-off is to actually get you into some familiar, like just build some familiarity and rapport with each other in this early stage of kind of exploring conversation, and then some roll up back to the large group via some reporting out. So I hope you'll just bear with us on that process point. Kaylin?
Sorry, technical difficulties. Yeah, I mean, I think as we start to transition back into in-person meetings, this seems like a way for us to gain some trust with each other, actually, the breakout rooms. I mean, I know having participated in the big work group processes before, that is a tool that for a facilitator will frequently have us do, where we'll break out for some discussions, pull back in, and I think we all trust that we can't all be in those spaces at the same time. And in the interest of efficiency and effectiveness, being able to have some deep discussion and then kind of pull out the salient points will keep us moving ahead. So while I wish that I could be clone myself into all of the different breakout rooms, I'm really interested to hear what comes out of those discussions and then build on that as we go forward.
Thank you. All right, so I think we're right on time. Tom, I'm gonna turn it over to you to provide some updates and maybe a little more perspective on sort of the charge of the group.
Thank you, Robin, and good morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone, and appreciate, at the outset, I just want to express my appreciation to the three representatives for their remarks, to reiterate and remind us of the opportunity that is in front of us with this work group. And I'd like to spend a minute or two, in addition to my updates on a few items, maybe just adding to those comments. You know, the shorthand for this work group is Regional Water Planning and Management Work Group. And I know just in our short experience together, that conjures up different images in everyone's minds. And I wanted to kind of share my perspective and my recommendation on how we might think about this. And I think it fits within what we heard from the legislators today. And that is, but first I would ask you to take a step back, and rather than focusing on that term, think about the several kind of fundamental elements. One is Oregon is in an era of water scarcity. We see that playing out in real time in basins across the state. It is a daunting, challenging situation for communities and people across the state, and it's going to get tougher over time. Secondly, I'd ask you to think about, do we want to help Oregonians, ourselves, our families, our friends, the people that live in the state, have a more secure water future going over time? And if that's the case, and I hope we all are pointed in that direction, what does it take to get there? And I think this group has the opportunity to really think about and to provide recommendations on a system that can help support people to pursue a secure water future in their communities around the state. Now, there's a lot of details in that. What does that look like? What does it mean to plan? Who should participate at what scale? But before you go down that rabbit hole and get too deep into that, I would offer another thing for us to think about as we look at this. And that is, when we talk about planning, we need to be mindful that it's not just about the act of planning that we're talking about. What we're talking about is having a plan based on good data that is inclusive and provides voices of whatever landscape is engaged in the planning, and that develops a plan, right? You all know that's not the end of the game. In some ways, that's just, we're still very much at the beginning. And so to me, that's kind of phase one, developing the plan. There's a lot in that. We're going to unpack some of that today with the elements discussion that we're talking about. But I would argue to you that our opportunity here with this group is to look at a couple more steps and how we can improve upon the system that currently exists. And that second step, in my mind, is around the notion of, you have a plan, now what? How do you make it actionable? How do you develop and design and do feasibility studies associated with the different ideas in that plan to turn them into potential projects? That is a traditionally underserved area as far as the state goes. And some of you practitioners out there know this. That tends to be where the money runs out, and there's not a lot of resources to help communities move from plan into viable projects. So that to me is kind of the second phase. And then the third phase is actually implementing a project. Many of you are familiar with that. That tends to be the area where the legislature is more willing to fund because it gets tangible results. But each of those steps, I believe, has a host of questions for this group in terms of should the state, what role should the state play? Should the state fund planning? If the answer is yes, well, what does that mean? What are the attributes that should be connected to that funding, given that it's a public resource? Should the state help with data on planning? Should the state help with the project design and feasibility studies? If so, what does that look like? Should the state help with funding projects? And is the way we're doing it today adequate, or are there improvements that could be made? To me, those are really the fundamental questions for this group. And if you provide recommendations to the legislature and to the next governor around those areas, I do think that Oregonians are going to be in a better position. And if those are acted on, that's a small little caveat there. I do think that puts Oregonians in a better position to resolve their water issues going forward. This group is not being asked to solve the problems in the Klamath Basin. You're not being asked to solve the issues in the Deschutes Basin. That's not the charge of this group. It's more looking at a system that can help support Oregonians on their journey to a secure water future. So I hope that's helpful. That's how I think about this effort. I think it's a huge opportunity. And maybe as a pivot to some of the report outs I wanted to give you, Representative Owens mentioned place-based planning, a legislative concept that we have. And yes, indeed, we will be developing a legislative concept around place-based planning, or in light of our authority running out at the end of this biennium around place-based planning. We have a workshop scheduled for May 10th around that, but I would offer to you that the charge of this group is broader than I think our legislative concept will be contemplating. It will be much more focused on planning, kind of that first phase of planning, I think, at this point, and not looking at the bigger picture like this work group can, and I hope does. That said, we are going to continue to keep our legislative concept placeholder in place and preserve it as an option should not knowing where this work group will go or where it will land ultimately. So there will be that kind of dual track approach that I want folks to be aware of going forward. Three other items just briefly to apprise you of. We'll be hearing from tribal representatives today. I'm very excited about that as part of our agenda, but I also wanted to note, and many of you may be aware of and interested in, a task force that's being set up between the 9 federally recognized tribes and the state agencies in particular. It's a tribal state agency task force. We've been in the early stages of organizing that effort. We've hired some facilitator just recently, and I think my hope is that we'll be starting that effort up, that task force up more formally by June. And I think the main focus will be on really educating each other between agencies and the tribes in terms of, the tribe's interest in water and the state agency's responsibilities associated with their various authorities. So I want you to be aware that is going to be starting up, and I'm very excited about that. I think that'll be a really important engagement for these multiple sovereign entities. The next item I wanted to update you on is the Integrated Water Resources Strategy. Many of you may know that the IWRS has a 5-year update, a requirement. If we were to follow through with that, we'd be working on that right now. I decided last year that in light of the enormity of some of the tasks and the importance of some of the tasks that we have as a result of the 2021 budget and legislation that was passed in the long session last year, that we would delay the formal update of the Integrated Water Resources Strategy. At this point, that formal kind of public process will not likely start until after the 2023 legislative session. That said, we're going to be doing some legwork internally to prepare for that. We were authorized and appropriated dollars for a position to help us with that, and that is in the process of, we're recruiting that position currently. And that person will put us in a position to be able to really hit the ground running when we're ready to open up a more formal public process around that. Our intention is to utilize efforts like this to help inform that update, whether it's this work group, the Tribal State Agency Task Force, or the 100-year vision. A lot of engagement happens through those processes, and we think it's important to add those into the mix as we consider updates to the broader Integrated Water Resources Strategy document. So I wanted to give you some context around that. This is a reminder for many of you, but it may be new news to others. So I wanted to put that on the radar screen. The last item I have for you all, I think in earlier meetings, there's been some interest expressed that state agencies pay attention to this effort, and I think that is important. And a number of state agencies are, like myself, like my agency, are ex officio members other agencies are paying attention to these meetings. But I also wanted to mention that we have a twice a month meeting of what we call the Water Core Team, which is has representatives, kind of deputy level representatives from multiple agencies, state agencies that are involved with water. We coordinate on a number of different items. This is one of the items that we coordinate on and update that membership around. So it's just I wanted to provide that as an example, just so that you know that the agencies are talking to each other, and that we will continue to use that forum to help update agencies who are not maybe spending as much time on this effort, but we want them to be aware, and we may, depending on the will of this group and where we head, we may want to pull in some of those agencies for conversations down the line. So I want you to be aware of that as well. And I think I'll wrap up my comments. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks, Tom. We have a little time for a couple questions. If folks have questions for Tom about any of what he's just teed up. Margaret.
Good morning, Director Byler. How are you?
I'm great, Margaret. Thank you.
Good to see you. Which agencies are in the Water Core Team?
Quite a few, and I probably will not mention them all, but
maybe which agencies aren't. So no.
Well, I'm not sure I want to go down that path, but let me give you the quick list would be Water Resources Department, OWEB, DEQ, Department of Ag, State Lands, Marine Board, Energy, Forestry, ODFW. I'm sure I'm missing a couple, OHA. And so there's a pretty, it's quite the alphabet soup.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, thanks for the updates, Tom. And so let's, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kimberly.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having technical issues. Tom, it was great to hear your thoughts, so thank you for that. I guess I just wanted to confirm or just make sure that the conversation continues with an equal focus on both in-stream and out-of-stream. I just say that because I maybe I missed it, but I felt like I was hearing the word people, communities, and not equal attention on ecosystems, fish and wildlife. So I just want to make sure that continues forward in these conversations.
Thanks, Kimberly. And I tend to use those terminology because it will be people making decisions and having those discussions. But I think we all know that that there are any of us who are practitioners in this arena know that there are balance of interests that you really have to take into consideration in this day and age, and whether it's endangered species or water quality issues, there's just a variety of issues that any effort towards securing a water future would be smart to bear in mind and to consider fully as they figure out what their long-term interests are and pursue them.
Peggy?
And just really quickly, the use of the word projects can set some people's hair on fire. But in fact, projects means lots of different things. And so I just want to make sure that as we're having those conversations, that just like the conversation you just had about fish and people, that you're also talking about a variety of projects. And I think that's really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Peggy. Kim has put into the chat the full list, all the acronyms associated with all the agencies that are part of the Water Core team. So you're about 9 out of 10, Tom. You're close. But Biz Oregon, Governor's Office, Regional Solutions, also part of that network of agencies. So it's pretty comprehensive group. And I'm imagining that other folks who are on this work group that are state agency folks are part of those as well. So at any point, we may ask you to kind of weave in some perspective from the agencies on ideas that are emerging from this group as well. Like Tom said. So given all of this, I think for the rest of today, we want to just drop in a little bit to some of the particulars around kind of what essential elements need to show up in these kind of regionally based or water basin based planning efforts that include planning, kind of building to action and implementation, and may add in their adaptive management as a critical kind of piece of the cycle. But really trying to drop into some more specifics around that. And, we've heard already in the conversations from this work group, a lot of kind of reaffirming of some of the preliminary or past kind of iterations of work that have led to this conversation in a lot of ways. From the IWRS, from the place-based planning guidance and evaluation, from the governor's 100-year water vision, several of the presentations from the last couple of sessions of the work group that really kind of illustrated or illuminated some of these particulars. So it's a lot to take in, but we'll try to drop in maybe to some bite-sized pieces for today and really tee us up, like I said, for ongoing conversations about these elements in June. I'm going to just a little bit on time. I'm going to hedge a little bit on time, and I'm just going to invite us to actually pull up the elements before we hear from the tribal panel. And I'm going to share just a abbreviated, it was shared with you in a broader kind of work plan document, but this is just the list of the actual elements. And I'm going to put it in the chat so everybody can have it right in front of you. Oh, sorry. So if you could just open that up for yourselves and take a look at this. And I want to be clear, the coordinating committee had a very light touch review of this. So those work group members did not kind of put their fingerprints all over this, and may very well have some suggestions of shifts, additions, whatnot. We are not going to try to wordsmith this or get it approved today. This is a living, breathing documentation of what has kind of emerged, like I said, in several processes. So it's really just an organizing feature for you. It's not an exhaustive list even per se. So what we want to do is just pull it up and ask you in this large group, if you've reviewed it, which we hope you've at least done a cursory review of this, to see if there's any big buckets that maybe are missing that we want to make sure get sort of elevated, even at the outset of these conversations. So just take a couple minutes to look at the list. And the group can kind of help you if you say, well, I have this particular thing. Does it fit in one of these buckets, or is it its own? We'll just kind of track that in this conversation. And if folks see that there might be a place for that in one of these elements, share that. But just give it a quick review, and we'll just invite a little bit of kind of reflection on that from the work group at this point. All right, some people have reviewed it. Mary Ann, and then Daniel, and then Kimberly.
Sorry, I had an issue with my mute button. Yeah, and I have two unrelated, it probably sounds like I'm trying to do a substitution, but I'm not trying to do a substitution. To me, the upholding the public value of water piece feels, I don't disagree that water is a public resource and has a public value. It just feels different than the other pieces that feel more like kind of process or foundation pieces to me. And so I just wanted to flag that. I don't know if that can be, I need more information on what's meant by that, because it feels different than like the data and the scope and sideboards, coordination, capacity, community engagement, framework, integration, accountability. That feels like a policy piece, I guess, more than a process piece, where the rest feel like process pieces. And then with that as a missing piece, and again, I'm not trying to do a substitution, it's a separate thought. And I don't know where it fits, is the kind of whole conversation around state recognition and how state recognition of a plan may occur, state role in the plan. And I know that's kind of in there under the, integration, I guess, kind of, maybe, I don't know. But again, that to me, integration seemed more like water supply and water quality together. So
Great.
wherever it fits, I didn't see a natural place for it.
Okay. All right. Question about, can the public see this list? Yes, I believe that material has been posted. Yeah, it does show up. I think it's called a framing, but you have access to it. There's a list of essential elements in the materials that have been posted to the web. So you can track along if you're interested. Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. I have a suggestion here. This may be something that goes under accountability, and it may be something that could be a brand new category. But as I listen to some of the comments that we get in our meetings, and also the document that you sent out where you reviewed the different planning efforts, and there were like different categories of different things that were included in the different plans. One of the things that keeps coming up over and over again is this trust issue. And especially some of the comments here about, what's happening in work groups, when the rest of us can't hear all the comments and stuff. It occurs to me that there's something we could do that could potentially elevate people's comfort and create more trust, because it seems like that's a really big issue. And so what I would like to recommend is potentially under accountability, we could have something about documenting that processes are being followed. So in other words, if we have these foundational elements and we've all agreed that these are the foundational elements that all the regional planning groups are going to follow, then maybe the planning groups, there should be something about them documenting how they've addressed each of these issues. And that would be something that would be available to the public for anyone who's not there. And so we could see that not only do we have a process, but that process is being followed. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Kimberly?
Yeah, I have a few things. I think just as far as big buckets that I felt were missing, similar to my comment earlier, in relation to Tom's opening comments, we would suggest just having a bullet that says meet in-stream and out-of-stream needs, and that carries over from past work with the integrated water resources strategy and other documents. Another sort of big bucket that I think is a standalone would be open and transparent process. And you could maybe fit that under some of the others, but I think it would be good for our conversation to have it as its own bucket. And then, some other things that I thought were missing that probably could go under some of these other headings is the word balance is not in there. Balance of interest is not in there. I didn't see anything that captured agency capacity and participation and funding of agencies to participate. Let's see. As to Marianne, I think that's actually an interesting point that you made, that there's sort of like process and policy. But one other thing, we may have two different buckets, but I guess I would add under upholding the public value of water. I would also add upholding the state's authority to manage Oregon's water resources. And let's see what else. Under integration, I would add, again, this goes to the agencies, integration amongst the agencies. And then finally, under accountability, I think I appreciate some of the previous comments on that. And I think actually there's a whole slew of things that could come under accountability, things like unbiased facilitators, public review and comment, balanced tables, fair means of participation, etc. So I think that one, especially, there's lots of room to flesh out. Anyway, those are just initial thoughts. Thanks.
Great.
This is Donna. Donna Beveridge with the Upper Grand Ronde, and I agree with most of what Kimberly said there. I feel like it's pretty vague. I feel like we need to put a lot more
Definition.
Yep.
On the integration piece or on all of it? I'm sorry, Donna, on the integration piece or on all of the pieces?
On pretty much every point's pretty vague. I think we need to add some detail to them, and I agree with most of what Kimberly said.
Great. Well, Donna, I think you're just hitting the nail on the head of what the task is before you all, is to actually put definition on these pieces. So what I'm hearing so far is there may be some new areas of elements, but there might also just be a lot of kind of sorting out what these things mean, why they're important and what they actually mean, and try to kind of coalesce around a shared definition or sense of what those things are. So I just appreciate that that's already what's starting to kind of roll forward from folks. So I'm going to go 4 more comments: Kristen, JR, April, and Dan, and then we'll reserve more conversation for later this afternoon, but this is just to start. So appreciate it. Go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, a number of my comments would be redundant to the prior ones. So I'll just highlight 2 things. One, somewhere in either the foundational information or potentially the scope and sideboards, I think we need to have real clarity around what the definition of success is. What is the target? And I think that's the space where you can really bring forward balancing of in-stream and out-of-stream needs. Is this a planning effort that's incorporating water quality, or is it quantity only focused? I just think sort of planning as this huge open window is challenging for groups versus having some clarity upfront about exactly what are the targets and how do we define success. And then that rolls down into the accountability piece of not only are all of those elements that you already have listed important, but I think the primary one is the solution able to deliver the outcomes promised? And sort of that lens of review that's coming, if there's an expectation that water efficiency projects are going to deliver a certain amount of conserved water that'll end up in stream, is that feasible, viable pathway that's something that can be implemented and the planning effort can be held accountable to it. So, and you could look at it other ways. There's this amount of additional on-farm demand. There's a vision of how we're going to fulfill that in balance with these other things. Is that realizable and possible to achieve? So I don't think that's just for an in-stream allocation. I think that goes both ways. But I guess what it comes down to is I'm looking for some of those quantitative metrics to come with this, as well as some of the qualitative.
Thank you. JR.
Thank you. I'll do some work on this, but I think that under foundational information, I think that it's really important that we separate out, for the purposes of discussion, foundational law from foundational information. So we've spent a lot of time on this, and I think we spent a lot of time locally, but the bottom line in anything we do planning, especially when you talk about regional planning, is that we're not sovereign entities. The only sovereign control entity that can do anything around water is the federal government, the tribal governments, and the state of Oregon. Those are the sovereign entities that are by law to uphold the management of the water resources. So whatever we do planning wise, the foundational law needs to be explained that this is more or less a guidance document to an entity that we have no control over on how they perform. And so, I mean, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news here, but planning is a waste of time if we don't clarify the foundational law that it's up to the state of Oregon, it's up to the Water Resources Department as the statutory management authority under state law to implement these plans. And so I think that we need to spend some time on foundational law to clarify that. And I think it's a lot more important than just the broad-based definition of foundational information, because I separate out information being monitoring and reporting and the information that guides decision from the law that tells you what decisions you're kind of needing to make. And so I think a separation there would be helpful. And then under the accountability piece, I think it's really important that we better define the ownership and risk management side of these projects. Again, as a local planning entity that's been trying to implement these, I feel like once these plans start to be implemented, the folks that usually take on all the risk are the ones that financially usually can't, and that's the private water users and the local communities. The state has minimized risk in these implementation strategies, and I'd like to highlight that on the accountability side as well if we're going to get into breakout groups and talk more. So those are the two areas that I think need a little bit more attention personally. So thanks.
Thank you. April?
So I have a few comments, and I know, Robin, you indicated you didn't want us to wordsmith, which I think is exactly what we've dived right into. And I'm very wanting to do that, but I'm going to resist the urge because I do think you've got a lot of good comments so far. But I think a few recommendations. One is that you've referenced the 100-year water vision and the IWRS and all that other stuff. The sources are not in this document, but they are in the PDF with the weird table thing in it that was sent out yesterday. And so for those that don't have that, you can click on there to get those specific documents. And the IWRS that's specifically linked in that other document is the most recent update. And I suggest, without getting into the wordsmithing, that rather than us try and reinvent the wheel that has already been torn apart several times over, that we borrow from some of those documents that you're already referencing, and specifically the IWRS page 14 in the most recent update. There's a few different bits you could take, but I think the big issue that I see missing, one of the issues I see with this essential elements is similar to other comments that have been made. It's important to make sure that all the various interests and needs that have an interest in water feel that they're represented in this, and that these planning efforts that we're looking to create a framework for are balancing all of those. I don't see anything in this document that talks about the economic value of water that it provides. And so for the constituency I represent, that's a major omission. But I would also reference that or call out that both in the IWRS and in the 100-year water vision, there's very similar language that talks about healthy waters, healthy economy, healthy environment, healthy cultures and communities. And there's a lot of different language in both of those that I think would be appropriate to include. And also, again, recognizing that we're all approaching this from different viewpoints, to be able to see that is all represented in there. Additionally, I'm going back between a couple different documents in the 100-year water vision, and these same elements are also in the IWRS. It talks about, as we've also talked about, making sure that this is structured within existing water law, and as comments JR made, that there may be that you need to have something that gets at ideas within current law, and then maybe if a community wants to dive into some of those issues, there's a separate bucket there. But in the 100-year water vision, on page 2, there's some discussion about balancing interests that again also references the IWRS principles, state framework with regional and local flexibility, coordination and collaboration. All of these things I think are elements that would be well served by including in a framework. And for some of you that may be thinking that is redundant, no, it's not, because if this is going to have any sort of traction and moving forward past the current governor into next year, and being able to actually become a real framework that helps communities plan for their water needs, then it needs to be something that specifically states all of those things. There's a few folks on here that know, actually there's a number of folks on here that were involved in some way, or their organizations were involved in that IWRS, and you know how long it took for those words that are on those documents to be crafted. And I don't want us to go down that same path, because we could easily spend a bunch of our meetings arguing over that. So I think there's a bunch in there that you could just paste right in there and reference again, either the IWRS or the 100-year water vision, and it's going to make folks feel a lot better about that. I think the other aspect that maybe is a question that we could come back to at some point is, I represent a group of a statewide organization, and we have members all around the state. And while there's a lot of similarities, there's also a lot of differences. And in each basin that I have folks that are looking at their planning needs, they're really very different as far as where they're at. The Deschutes versus the Umatilla versus the Rogue versus the Klamath versus the Willamette, Hood River, Oahe, whoever else I've missed, I'm sorry. But it is something where I think some of those places don't even know where to start. And so they're looking at a table setting kind of exercise and needing to have that framework and developing the data that we've talked about, whereas others are a lot further down the road and maybe ready to test some of those ideas out, or want to be able to test some ideas out, but they're not quite to a feasibility phase. And that's a different type of planning exercise, and there's a different set of tools that might be necessary for a group that's at that phase. So I don't know if that made sense, but I think it's something that recognizes that communities, again, recognizing that may be defined differently by folks, but that using it loosely, communities are in different stages and are going to have different needs for both the framework and the technical resources that will help support them to move forward. And I think one of the other elements that came through when folks were talking is that if you're driving on, well, how implementable is an idea, that's not going to really work for a community that's just starting and building trust. Because as some of you guys know, if you go right to, oh, let's do a bill or let's change policy, you're going to destroy all of that trust and momentum that you built if you go down that path too fast. So I think that's something that's just kind of recognizing that there's a spectrum of interests.
Yes. I'm hearing the nutshell of that, April, is to meet communities and needs where they're at. And maybe there's a way for you all to weave that premise and principle into some of these elements as we go into the conversation. I'm going to move on to Dan, and then we need to move on to our tribal panel. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick. Actually, I'm going to reverse. I was kind of go from general to a little specific, but picking up on JR's comments about the recognizing kind of these legal and structural constraints that are out there. I think that is kind of overlooked, and you're just not going to get anywhere if you don't realize that there may be some elements of state law and certainly of our interplay with federal things that can definitely implicate not only, the planning, but the implementation of anything anybody wants to do, and whether it's restoration, whether it's storage projects, I don't care what it is, they kind of applies the same way. So I think we need to do that. And then I guess that raises a more general issue when, and essential elements just by itself, I kept saying essential elements of what? It kept coming to mind. And I found, if I just read through those essential elements, it really seems to be focusing on the planning aspect, which is huge, but it kind of ties into comments that were made by various folks earlier today in terms of, aren't we also talking about, like Tom was saying, that basically the three phases is the planning, there's the conceptualization or whatever you want to call it, a project. And again, the project could be anything from a storage project to a restoration project to whatever, a broad sense of what that means. And then thirdly, implementation of the project. And if it's really supposed to include that full picture, which I think makes sense, because planning with no view towards implementation, I don't think is very productive. So that just my take at looking at the overall feel of that is that it kind of just stops at planning. and doesn't include a lot of these specifics that might, if you're going farther down, what you need to pay attention to, which other people have already mentioned. So that's it.
Thanks, Dan. Tom?
Just really briefly, and I'm not adding, I'm actually maybe suggesting, Robin, as you want to move on to the next item, that if, I don't want to get ahead of the group, but if it would be helpful, Lily could do a crosswalk to the language in the IWRS and the 100-year vision, as was suggested by a few folks. Let's look at that rather than trying to recreate the wheel, and we could bring that forward to a future meeting for further consideration if folks are interested.
Yeah, to me, that would be a little bit of a expansion of what she did provide, which was in the table. And maybe it wasn't, we didn't pull enough of it out, but yeah, if that's, folks want to see more clearly kind of some of the foundational, even the language that was used in those hard fought foundational documents, we can pull those over. We know it's important for people to be able to see that work that came before you. So in the interest of time, we need to move on. And I do appreciate that this is really getting the juices going on these conversations, and hope that everyone has an opportunity to lean in a little bit more this afternoon. But let's pivot now to hearing from our tribal perspectives panel. And for this, like we did last time, I'd invite the tribal folks who are going to be speaking to come forward on the screen, and everybody else, you can turn your video off to listen in. And then we'll pull everybody back onto the video after the round of presentations. So we'll just kick back and listen. I will just premise or kind of tee this up a little bit with the three topics that we maybe put before this group to think about, ponder, and maybe reflect back to this group in no particular order and no particular preference on one, two, or all three. But one is kind of what's the overarching tribal worldview, relationship with water, history, culture. Second, what do individual tribal perspectives on engagement and relationship with the state with regards to water issues, agencies, programs, resources, other practices in other public policy sectors, et cetera. And then finally, the individual tribal perspectives on engagement and the role in planning and investing in planning, project development, project implementation within kind of regional planning construct. So what's that experience for tribal communities, tribal representatives, tribal governments? So it's a very dynamic, complicated piece, and I just really appreciate those tribal representatives who are here to share kind of highlights. It's really, we definitely could spend years diving into this, but did want to just get some flavor going into this to add into your all's repertoire of conversation. So again, thank you. And in no particular order, I don't know if one of you wanted to start, but I'll just sit back and help us just manage time, really.
Well, thank you, Robin. And it looks like it's going to be me and Bobby and Anton today. Is that correct? Or
we have Kala as well.
Oh, yes, there you are.
Yeah.
Hi, Kala. Didn't mean to overlook you. Okay, so 4. So that's good to know. We had some preliminary conversations kind of thinking about what might be helpful here. And I think, we all definitely have some unique ideas to share. I think some of our tribal partners who have been involved in regional planning efforts also have had some more kind of specific lessons learned and thoughts that I think might be really helpful, both in terms of their experience with regional planning efforts and how it fits in here. So I would defer to them if they would like to go first. And Kala, I'm not sure how you feel, but I'd be happy to kind of wait and go towards the end if that's okay with others.
So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Kala Hagel. I'm the Natural Resources Director for the Burns Paiute Tribe. And we have had a regional planning effort over in the Harney Basin, which is sort of the heart of where the Burns Paiute Tribe's traditional territory is. I haven't been a part of, I think there were some pre-meetings with the other tribal staff that they were pulling together some thoughts and ideas. And I wasn't a part of those meetings. And unfortunately, Jason Fenton, who's our environmental program manager, was, and he's not available this week. But I will try to start us off. And I don't know if we want to start at the top with the tribe's relationship with water, or I can just dive right into talking about what that place-based planning, what that relationship has looked like with the tribe and sort of some of the insights that have been gleaned there. Robin, do you have a preference?
No, but maybe do start with the bigger picture.
So I probably would have to defer back to the tribes that have kind of gotten together and talked about how they'd like to coordinate those comments. But I can also start us off a little bit, unless Bobby, it looks like you're unmuted. So I guess I would just frame it as tribes don't see water as only a resource that should be conserved and protected for its worth to people and wildlife. I think there's, it's seen as an entity in its own right, and it really should be treated as something that has intrinsic value as well as the obvious economic and social value that it provides. Like many things that provide for people, it should be treated with respect. And so the overuse of pollution of water could really be seen as a violation of its rights. And that's, some of the information that I've been given by the Burns Paiute tribe and the cultural staff here. So I'll defer to the others if they have additional comments.
Hello, everyone. I guess I'll jump in here. First of all, I'm the general manager of natural resources for the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. I'm also the tribal historic preservation officer here for the tribes. And so I'll talk about the importance of water to the tribes here. And this is something that we talk about a lot here in Warm Springs. And I was just talking to our tribal council a week ago today about water. And that is the importance of water to Warm Springs. We're river people. We come from the big river, from the Columbia River. So living along a river with a good water quality is important to us for our community. And fish are very important to us. So the salmon and all the fish that are in the streams is very important to the tribe. So there's a gift the Creator gave us, and that gift is water. And we are to take care of that water. We are supposed to look after that water because that water can take care of us and all of us here. So that is something that when you're in Warm Springs, it's something that we honor. It's something that we honor in all our ceremonies that we have here, is that we honor water is the first thing. So it's very, very, very important. I can't stress that enough, how important that is to us here in Warm Springs. It's part of what we talk to our staff about that are non-tribal members that come to work for us here in Warm Springs. We remind them that this is a gift that was given to us and it's important to us. So we need to take care of it. Warm Springs has all the needs that everyone at the table has today. We want good, clean water for our communities. We want good water for our fish and for the ecology out there on the reservation and the waters around us. We want have good water and have that in balance with other needs the tribes have. The tribes have a farm. We operate a farm. It's over 400 acres. So we're irrigators also. So we're constantly thinking about how do we balance these needs? How do we take care of this water? Because it is a precious commodity for the tribes. Now a little bit about working with the state, and we follow water very closely in a lot of different areas. We of course live in the Deschutes Basin. That's where our reservation is. So we follow water very closely in the Deschutes Basin, but we work in other areas too. John Day Basin, we have offices in John Day, so we follow the water, what's going there. We help landowners over there have better efficiency with irrigation systems, so we get more water back into the streams in the John Day. We work in the Hood River Basin with the orchards and monitoring well and what's happening with their waters. They've had issues with those over the years, and we help. We also follow what's happening in the Willamette Valley with water, in the Willamette River itself and all the tribs. So that's important to us because we have fisheries and tribal practice still going on over there. Of course, the big one being the Columbia River. We definitely follow what's happening in the Columbia River, well engaged in the Columbia River, and what's happening with water and fisheries in the river there. So these are things that we follow. These are things that we interact with agencies on. And so again, a broad area that we cover for Warm Springs. One thing, I was looking at the list, Tom, of the different agencies that you interact with, and I was actually, I'm glad you brought it up because it was actually on my list here of, how are the agencies working with each other? There's a lot of overlap. What kind of overlaps are there? It's good to know that there's a group and that you guys are meeting regularly on that. One I would add or make a recommendation to that I don't see on the list here is state parks. We have worked with state parks over the years also on things like DIAC flows, and that being recreational flows. We've talked to state parks about lands that they have that are state parks that have waters running through them. That an example is, and some folks may be familiar with this, most probably aren't, is a place called Bates Pond on the Middle Fork of the John Day, and water concerns there and fish passage and fish concerns there. So that's just a suggestion, a recommendation to maybe also add state parks with them, given some of the experience that we've had with them over the years. There is one of the things I'm looking at my notes here is in listening to people today. There are things that we've noticed and have seen, and I'm glad this has happened for state parks or for a water resource department, that there's been more funding that's come in for them to be able to hire more staff, do some more work that's critical for all of us, and be able to also have these type of forums to talk about water. So having a better budget for the department is a good thing, and maintaining that out into the future will be a good thing. Now I come back to Warm Springs and some of the things that are limiting for us at times, and that's capacity. And you may hear this from other tribes too, is just capacity, being able to attend all these different forums and having the ability to engage and have the proper funding to be able to have those good conversations. So it's I think an important thing to think about. It's something that I know we struggle with at times. We do our best to try to cover all these broad areas that I mentioned earlier in these different basins. But that is something I think if we could think about that would be helpful. The other is into the future is, I think the data is important. We need to get more data. We need to understand what's going on with our water in these different basins. All the basins are different, not all the same. So what is happening with the groundwater? What's happening with the surface water? What are the interaction? We need more of those type of information and understanding. We also and this cuts across all of us, is climate change. And what is happening with climate change? We're all experiencing drought right now. But beyond drought, what is going to look like? Our water's not going to come as much as snow anymore, and we're going to get more rain than snow. So with that said, is what as a group here, all of us working a meeting today on is, how can we work on that challenge, and how can we create abilities to have the ability to respond to things like drought that we're in right now. So what are the policies in place? What are the things there? Can we make them more flexible, or more adaptive into the future? Because this is going to be with us for a while, and we need to understand that and have policies that are in place that make us be able more flexible and adaptive as we move forward. So that's something for me that's important to think about, and I'm sure others also here. So with that, I'll let others speak, and but those are some of the points, some of the things that came to my mind as asked about why this is important for the tribes to be at the table for water. It's very important to us, and some of the things that we've been thinking about here in Warm Springs. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Bobby. Kathleen, do you want to go next?
Sure, I can do that. Thank you. First of all, to start, I'm Kathleen George, elected tribal councilwoman for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. And I will be speaking today in my role as a tribal councilwoman. I know that everyone on this call wears many different hats, but that's who I'm representing. And I just felt it was important to be clear about that this morning. So like everyone else, I'm acknowledging that some of what I want to share is background. Some of it is unclear or challenging, and it makes me wonder how we move forward. And at the same time, I agree that we could be doing nothing better than trying to come together and find a better path forward and find recommendations that could make the situation better. So starting with kind of the tribal worldview question, or framing your tribe's relationship to water. So there's so many different groups represented on this call. It's important to recognize that all the groups here interact with and have a variety of values around water. I'm going to share with you some of those around our tribe, and Bobby did that too. 3 weekends ago, I went down to Klamath country, and on a very snowy Saturday morning, I gathered with representatives from 8 of the Oregon tribes to hold a first intertribal water healing ceremony. And this is something that the Oregon tribes have been talking about recently, as we have recognized the need to really come together around the need to heal our waters and our fisheries, and that we see this issue as one of great urgency. And we don't really see that reflected as much in the, kind of the state debate. It isn't, fisheries recovery is something that, you don't hear on the news that much, but that we consider it really, really important and really, really urgent, as many of our traditional tribal fisheries are on the brink of extinction. And so it was really a powerful day, but it's the first time ever any of us were aware of this intertribal need, this statewide north, south, east, west recognition that our waters are sick, they're not well, and they haven't been for a long time, and that it's going to require urgent action on our parts to restore them and to save our fisheries. And at the same time, we have the same needs, as was said earlier, than other communities. We are a growing tribal community, recovering after termination. Many of our tribal members want to move home, and so we're building more housing. And we need to plan for that, and all the systems that includes, both drinking water and wastewater treatment and in-stream needs, and all the things that we have to plan for. I do think one thing that it is really worth recognizing, and that is an important statement about how the tribes come to this process and where we are today, is that our current paradigm, our current water rights system, that's based on this, first in time, first in line kind of policy, And if you stop and think about in the state of Oregon, what was going on for tribes in the times where the most important, most valuable senior water rights were being given out, Oregon water rights, I want to be clear. Most of the tribes in this state were terminated at those times. So of the 9 tribes of Oregon, most of the tribes, their federal recognition was taken from them. And it was an attempt to eradicate those tribes, to hope that they'd just go away and not exist anymore. Fortunately, very fortunately, some of our tribes, and represented on this call here today, managed to not be victim to that federal policy. But at the same time, I think it can fairly be said that they weren't exactly times of tribal empowerment in the state, and that they faced many, many obstacles and challenges themselves. So the tribes come to the table from this position of a very intentional, strategic demolishing of their identity and their ability to involve themselves in the allocation of important resources with the state of Oregon. And so I just think that was intentional. It was not by the action of the tribes, and it influences fundamentally how we come to the table today. Now, undoubtedly, some folks would say, oh, but Kathleen, don't forget that some tribes have adjudicated their water rights, and they have water rights in that capacity. And that is certainly true. I'm sure there's people on here who could speak more about this than me. But this is historic case law and a statutory process designed to determine the water rights for tribes that existed for reservations before the adoption of the Oregon Water Rights Code and federally reserved water rights. I don't get to spend our time here today talking about that, except to say that is no short-term solution. The Klamath tribes took over 40 years to get their water rights adjudicated and are still facing many of the challenges they are today. Warm Springs was able to, and Tom can say more, but I was working for the Umatillos when they started the process to try to get their water rights adjudicated. And to my knowledge, it hasn't happened yet. So nothing quick is going to happen in that forum. And so nothing that is engaged with the kind of solutions that the people on this call want to engage in is not going to overlap with that time frame. And so I'm just going to leave that there, because I don't think anybody is looking into the kind of time frame that requires, not to mention all the legal and technical complications. I think the last thing for me to stress there is what has already been said, which is to say that the values of tribal people around our rivers and our fisheries are just integral. They're one with tribal identity and tribal culture, and they cannot be separated. We don't, again, have time. We could spend a whole day on this as well, but they simply cannot be separated. And we have to acknowledge that our tribes are fisheries people, they're salmon people, they're eel people, they're Chwam people, and they're going to want a seat at the table, both to represent their communities and to represent those resources. The historical aspect I mentioned also has to do with how tribes come to the table today, and I think both Bobby and Kala mentioned this as well. Capacity is a huge issue. Most of our tribes have relatively small tribal governments, and they're asked to be involved in dozens and dozens of processes that they cannot possibly staff all of them. And so also we have to recognize that around the state in different regions, we're talking about regional planning here, there's some wide diversity of relationships between tribal governments, local government, local industry, and who holds the power in different regions of our state. There are some tribes, because of their rights or their roles and that they've already taken on, they are given a seat at the table when important decisions surrounding water and critical resources are made. We have other tribes in other parts of our state who are still intentionally excluded, or attempts are made to just kind of bypass them. And often not because of a lack of interest, but because of a lack of capacity. The tribes sometimes don't have a way to intercede in those processes. So as I'm trying to work with others to think about, well, what do we need? What are the opportunities here? How would it work better than it works today? It would be, I think, to explicitly acknowledge that tribes are governments with government-to-government relationships with both federal and state agencies, and that there are obligations there that require the tribes to be meaningfully engaged in any water planning process that impacts their people or their resources. But in many cases, there will be a very real need for support, for planning, for monitoring, for policy support, and an understanding that the rivers and fisheries are inextricably connected to tribal people and tribal culture. So I think I'm going to stop there because I want to be sure that we have lots of time for Q&A and for our other speakers. Oh, I guess there's just one last anecdote I'll share as an example of what I mentioned in regard to some wildly different relationships in different parts of the state between tribes and local entities. And as I mentioned, I work for the Grand Ronde tribe. We were terminated and restored. And as I said, we're in the process of rebuilding our community here in Grand Ronde. And that involves in building our government and our housing. And so we've been building housing pretty consistently, and we're going to continue to do that. But you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that in the little town of Grand Ronde, the tribe is doing the most building and the most planning and the most development here in this area. But there is still a local water resources board that we work with, and we've worked hard with, and I think we have very much better relationships than we once did. But years and years ago, when I first started working for the Grand Ronde tribe, and those relationships were not as developed, and there were different people at the table, the local Board of Water Resources actually was almost on the verge of passing a resolution saying that they would not give any new water allocations to the tribe, to tribal applications, but others would, because they wanted other people to be able to continue to build housing, but they didn't want the tribes to build any more housing. Now, we were able to head that off and to have a good conversation about that, and cooler heads prevailed. But that was about 20 years ago. So some of the challenges that face tribes are not just historic in terms of 50 or 100 years ago. Some of them are really present today. And I think it'd surprise a lot of people how institutional some of these old prejudices are. But we continue to work on them and to build better relationships. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathleen. Anton.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. Thank you for your time today. My name is Anton Kiono. I work in the Department of Natural Resources for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. We're a confederation of 3 different tribes, the Umatilla, Cayuse, and Walla Walla tribes. Our office is here in Pendleton, Oregon, but the tribe's homeland stretch across Southeast Washington and Northeast Oregon. The Umatilla tribe's approach to natural resource management really has been based upon this notion of reciprocity, or this understanding that the natural community will take care of the human community if the human community takes care of the natural community. Really, we're all one and the same interconnected community, so we need to make sure that all of the parts of that community are strong. So it's really this reciprocal understanding with the natural world. Umatilla tribes further refine this concept through the notion of the first foods, or those original culturally important food resources that were produced by any given ecosystem. And the Department of Natural Resources management charge is to ensure that the ecosystems that produce these first foods are healthy and functioning as they should. This approach focuses more on the health of ecological processes, not so much the ends, the resources themselves, because it relies on this understanding that if the ecosystem is working well and is healthy and functioning, then it will provide the sustainable supply of resources for the human communities and all the other communities that have demands placed upon it. Certainly, and sustainability is a big part of this notion, and placing unsustainable demand levels on an ecosystem or resource undermines the health of that ecosystem and its processes, and will lead to poor outcomes for both the human and natural communities. Water naturally is the first of the first foods, and all other flora and fauna and communities and first foods depend upon that. So water is very, very important. Yeah, as such, the Umatilla tribes have done their best to be very involved in water planning and water management discussions across the region, certainly. We were involved in the Upper Grand Ronde place-based planning effort, and to a lesser extent, the John Day planning effort. We enjoyed the opportunity to participate in the learning partnership that took place across all the different place-based planning efforts, and going and traveling to each of those basins and learning about the particular problems that the place-based groups were facing. Some were very unique, and then of course some were certainly universal across the basins. The one thing that really struck us, I think, was that unfortunately just many of the basic planning needs remain unmet to even grapple with creating a plan. And really at its heart, the planning effort requires a water budget created. And we found, and I think the other place-based planning groups probably encountered a similar dilemma. We just didn't have the data that we needed to really create a good water budget on which to base our plan. And we were lacking very basic things about water supply. The gauging networks in our basins were insufficient, and many had been discontinued for a lack of funding. There was some demand about what out-of-stream use is needed. Granted, it's easier to quantify that demand, but very little when it came to in-stream demand. In some areas, the most up-to-date studies we had were from 1975, and unfortunately, things have and continue to change quite a bit since 1975. So we really need to take a better look at what our natural resources need, so we have a better sense of the debits and credits. And I always like, I don't know if anybody has checkbooks anymore, but I always like to get my checkbook out. If you don't have a good sense of what's coming in, what's going out, and what you need, it's very hard to balance these things. And I think it's very much analogous when we face water planning. We need to know these basic things, but unfortunately, we really lack a lot of the data to have a good sense of that understanding. And particularly now with climate change changing a lot of those things. During the place-based planning process, we really had a fuller appreciation for the importance of capacity for the different agencies that manage our natural resources across the state. And it really was evident that we need parity in the support for capacity at those agencies to help participate in the planning efforts. So that's certainly something we would like to see in the future, a greater emphasis on making sure that the agencies have the tools and the funding to be part of these planning efforts. Certainly that was a challenge we saw going through the place-based planning in the couple basins during the pilot efforts. Going forward, we're excited to see a robust budget for particularly OWRD. We're excited about some of the policy option packages that are under consideration. Hopefully good things will come from that, but certainly we need much work still. And there's much work to be done for sure. And going forward, one of the other things that has really become evident is better defining who has the seat at the table. And the place-based planning process, the state did a terrific job preparing guidance for each of the planning steps. And part of that included a better consideration of, are there tribal nations that are affected by water planning in a particular basin? And I think this was really perhaps an eye-opener for a lot of basins, that there would even be tribal interest in their water resources, but certainly there is. And it might not be because a tribe is physically located in that basin, but they may have treaty rights reserved in that basin. So it's very important to keep that in mind going forward. And really, I think it's part of this broader seat at the table question when we're looking at local or regional water planning. It's critical that local communities help lead these efforts, are invested in the effort and the outcome. There has to be that local buy-in, but we have to remember that it's not just the local communities who have an interest in the outcome of water in a particular basin. And that's certainly true where there are tribal treaty rights reserved for tribes that may not be located there, or just public trust generally for the effective management of fish and wildlife resources, which of course are transboundary by nature, and making sure that we protect and sustain those natural resources. So I don't know that there are easy answers to that seat at the table question, but it certainly is an important one that we can't lose sight of. I know it's not necessarily earth-shattering or provocative to say we need more data, and certainly it's not about science or data. A lot of this comes to policy and management decisions, and certainly those questions are separate from good data and good management capacity. But I don't think we can truly engage in those policy and management decisions, which really at heart are about values. Talking about values, very hard to do that when we don't have a lot of the fundamental data that we need to engage in that, to create our water budgets, or balance our checkbook, or attempt to balance our checkbook. So I think we need to do that, even if advocating for that is not necessarily earth-shattering. I mean, there's ample ground to plow when it comes to discussing the merits of the prior appropriation paradigm, and certainly the tribes definitely have perspectives on that. But before we can even get there, in a lot of senses, we need to engage in these management and data issues first, and then we can get to those broader questions, which we need to do. But I guess we need to begin at the beginning in a lot of places and make sure that we have the data we need and the management capacity we need to engage in these issues. And that's a lot of where we've been coming from right now, trying to make sure that we have that foundation to build upon and go forward. So just some thoughts from out here in Northeast Oregon, and I think we might have some broader relevance across the state. But look forward to the continued discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton. Cal, I'm going to circle back to you in case there was anything else you wanted to fill in or add to what you spoke to earlier.
Sure. I don't have a lot to add. I think that great summaries from everyone. I think I would just agree with almost all of the comments. Anton had mentioned that within their place-based planning, that there were issues with data not being in hand at the time when the conversations began within the community, asking them to engage in basin planning. And the exact same thing happened over in Harney Basin. And so despite those hydrologic conditions in the system in the basin not being well understood, it had been over allocated for years prior to the planning process beginning. And so, I think that is, an important point to be made, and something that, with stronger planning, hopefully that is something that can be dealt with within a water budget, as Anton had mentioned, so that, where that's been over allocated, maybe some difficult decisions need to be made. I would also mention again that yes, capacity within tribal departments is always an issue. Often tribes only have time, staff, and occasionally an invitation really to only consult at the end of a planning process, by which time there may be feelings that maybe like all of the input has been had in that process, and they're kind of considered a final draft product. I think that we often also have trouble knowing at what point that consultation process needs to begin, and also how consultation should be defined. And so I think, turning to state departments to really have coordination and engagement with true government to government or technical consultation as determined by an agreed upon process that the tribes, are able to enable, meaningful engagement with the tribes and the state agencies. It's a tough position sometimes because tribes are sovereigns. And so having conversations in community-based stakeholder meetings, we can have, technical staff there, and we often do. But there is a second layer of conversations and consultation that needs to be had for the state to truly meet its trust requirements. That would really require agencies to consult on these plans with tribes as co-managers of the resource and the area in a separate forum. And I guess, just not limiting that consultation to specific topics, like things that people, often think that tribes would only have interest in this narrow subset of issues. There's often a very broad range of things that tribes are concerned with or might consider, a part of what they'd like to engage on, beyond, just what maybe preconceived notions would have of cultural and natural resource concerns, especially with regards to water. So it just seems like some agencies might struggle with the concept of consultation and what exactly that means. And, maybe some of these conversations are the place to start defining what those relationships and that collaboration could look like in the future and strengthening that. So I also think it might come from working for a tribe on the east side of the state. But I think it just generally does sometimes feel like there are incredibly concerning things that happen within the water space, and there can often be somewhat of a blind eye turned to those concerning things. And so I really, in the future, again, want to echo what others said, that hoping that the additional capacity around water issues at the agencies and that interjection of legislative funds will hopefully assuage some of those problems that have maybe come up in the past when it comes to tribes engaging in meaningful conversations around water.
Well, thank you, the four of you, for sharing your thoughts on this. I know there's a lot more depth and breadth and complexity to the tribal perspective on these issues. But I appreciate you just sharing some initial thoughts with this group about sort of that perspective and engagement in water planning. We'll take a break at 1, but I do want to just give a little bit of time in case work group members have follow-on questions for any of the presenters. And I would like to preference those who haven't had a chance to get your voice in the room yet today. So please, if you are so moved, please come forward if you haven't spoken up. But really, this is a inquiry, questions to the presenters. We'll be getting into dialogue after the break. Peggy.
I have spoken before. Peggy Lynch, League of Women Voters. Thank you all for your presentations. The League counts on the tribe's interests in water and in their tribal authority to help with Oregon's water issues. I did want to mention one quick thing, and as Bobby Bruno mentioned about climate and mentioned drought, the other part about climate we need to not forget is flooding. So we are going to have issues not only around the lack of water, but water coming at the wrong time in the wrong place and could be dangerous. So I suspect very much that each of you already know that and have that planned. But I did want to make sure that it got on the table, and thank all of you for your presentation.
Folks can bring yourselves back on video at this point if you can and want to, and we'll go to Oriana.
Yeah, so I have 3 relatively short but interrelated questions, if I may. And Robin, I want to check with you if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the interrelated questions are about process in working with tribal governments, and I'll ask them together. The first is, Councilwoman George, you had talked about the capacity issue. I'm curious to hear how folks hope processes will either continue and engage in consultation or slow down if there's not capacity for tribal governments to be present at the table, and better understand what that looks like. You also talked about treaty rights, and earlier in our conversation, we talked about some of the barriers associated with planning from a legal perspective, but I think it would be helpful for me to understand how you might want to see treaty rights incorporated into this process as we talk about some of those legal issues that come up and structural issues that come up. And then the last piece is, some processes are not necessarily initiated by local or state governments. What are the expectations for those processes when there isn't necessarily a clear government to government relationship? And how would tribal governments hope to be consulted or engaged in those spaces, acknowledging that, say, an organization like mine might start and engage in a process, but not necessarily have that government to government relationship?
There's a lot there, and I'll do my best and invite my colleagues to help. So the capacity issue, I think it's an absolutely critical one, and I appreciate your highlighting it. I mean, so you have one option, you have tribes with very limited capacity, and you want to do something significant and meaningful to improve the situation for users, all users in the basin. If an entity like a tribe, who the state has, government to government consultation responsibilities with, is not at the table, and I think that's a failed process. Like, you can't get to a good outcome if the state can't uphold its responsibilities to consult in a government to government process. You may also not know about other treaty or adjudicated water rights like the Klamath or the Warm Springs, the Umatilla might have. Those entities aren't at the table. It kind of comes back to JR's point about foundational understanding of what needs to be met in the system. And if those realities aren't understood from the beginning of a process, you could really be undermining the hope for success of any project you could come up with. So, I appreciated, Anton's comment, and it's true to say, yeah, well, we need resources to support this is not a revolutionary thing, but I think it is a cautionary reality that unless tribes can come to the table with support for the ability to represent their interests and their needs, then the obligations of the state, and depending on who all is involved, if there's federal agencies involved, those entities are simply not going to be able to fulfill their obligations. So I think we have to take it as essential that those tribes are going to have to be at the table, and that conversations will need to happen about how that can happen and how that can happen well. You mentioned treaty rights and tribal rights. There's treaty rights. There's, like we said, there's other things like adjudicated water rights that might need to be considered. So I'm going to put those, while treaty rights are critical, there's other rights that may be tribal rights that could be, again, critical to be understood in a process. And yes, I mean, I think they have to be foundational, but again, this is one of those great challenges where, let's say you have a right to harvest fish, but you have a river that is so hot and has been for so long that there are hardly any fish you can eat, or they are not healthy because of pollution in that stream. These are the issues that tribes are dealing with all the time, and trying to engage with state and federal and local partners to address and improve upon. So that's this challenge is kind of the reality of tribal natural resources work. And so we're right there with you. We know that treaty rights and tribal rights have to be foundational in the process, but they also have to be meaningful, right? If your fisheries are on the brink of extinction, your right to harvest fish is not what it could be. And so I think that's why you typically see tribes coming in with very, very supportive positions to try to restore our rivers and streams, and to try to make sure our fish have the water that they need for their life cycles. And engagement, I'm so glad to hear that, that increasingly you and others and nonprofits and local groups may be wanting to partner with tribes. And I completely welcome that. I'm sure my colleagues do as well. We spend a lot of time, out here in Grand Ronde developing just those types of partnerships, whether it's with nonprofits or the county or local towns. And those partners in your local area are the ones where you often probably have the most in common with. You have similar goals. So I would always encourage folks to do that. Reach out. All the tribes have a webpage, and they usually have like a tribal council webpage or tribal government webpage. I would encourage you to reach out, give a call, shoot an email. There's usually somebody who's handling tribal council's affairs, or you could always just send it to the tribal council itself. Usually you can find our email addresses right on those websites. But we really welcome that kind of engagement. And it has led to many very, very powerful partnerships. I mean, Anton and JR could speak much better than I could to like the Umatilla Basin Project. There were a lot of non-governmental partners in there who came to the table, and their participation was essential in making something that worked better for everybody. So thank you for that interest, and we appreciate it. So any other thoughts?
Other presenters want to speak to any of the questions before we go to break? Bobby?
Sure. For Warm Springs, about this process right now is one, you're not going to see Warm Springs wanting to slow this process down. I think we've already said we're going to be at the table like I am right now and continue forward and making sure that, we're all working together and can come up with some things good. So that's Warm Springs. The treaty rights. So for Warm Springs, we have a treaty right from our treaty of June 25th, 1855. We also have the oldest water right in the Deschutes Basin. It's time immemorial. So it's the oldest water right in the basin. We have, our treaty rights are to be able to fish, hunt, gather our cultural foods, and to pasture livestock on unclaimed lands. Unclaimed lands are lands that are like the Forest Service, the BLM, and so this is a right that Warm Springs has. We have a fishery going on right now in the Columbia, and we just got done with ceremonial fishing, and so those are fish that we honor. We've honored the water, and we honored the fish before we started our fishery, and we can't fish until we've done these ceremonies. And so I can hardly wait when I hear numbers are running in the river there for them to have the ceremony, so I can get down there and catch some fish. But that's just some of the treaty rights that Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs have, and that's in a large area. The treaty defines our ceded lands that we ceded to the U.S. government. It's 10 million acres. Takes in most of the Deschutes Basin, takes in all of the John Day Basin, takes in all of the Hood River Basin. We also have our usual custom stations to be able to exercise these rights that are not in a boundary. So example is we set a season for fishing for smelt in the Cowlitz River every year. So we have a fishery there. We have fishery for eels at Willamette Falls. We have huckleberry pickers that go to Gifford Pinshaw National Forest to go huckleberry picking around Trout Lake. So that is not defined by any boundary. These are places that our people have gone for generations, and we don't know where all the places are that they go to, but it's a huge area in multiple states. So that's a little bit about our treaty with the U.S. government. We are a sovereign, and so when we have discussions, we will have at times government discussions with the federal agencies or the state of Oregon, and those are beyond this forum. This is a different forum that they have those type of discussions on with the governor's office or others, and that's when our tribal council gets engaged in those type of discussions. So right now, when I'm sitting here at this table talking with everyone here, I'm talking at what we call the small C consultation as the representative of a technical side of the tribe. So me being engaged in right now is not government consultation with the state of Oregon. That's at higher level than me, and that's at our tribal council level. Working with the tribes, generally we work a lot with the federal agencies because they're our trustee looking out for those resources for the tribes. And so the BLM, the Forest Service, NRCS, Farm Service, Corps of Engineers, you name it, EPA, they all have a trust responsibility to look out for our resources. And so when we're doing work with them and also with the state, we ask that they have projects or things that they're doing, that they write those letters to our tribal council and address our chairman. But if it's natural resources, make sure you CC myself and staff on that. So they get a lot of mail. So we want to make sure we are able to look for that. When it comes to non-governmental organizations, that's a different story. Those are nonprofit groups most of the time. A lot of times they're not a sovereign. So we ask that perhaps those groups meet with our technical staff. You want to talk to us, you get a hold of us at our level. There's a lot of NGOs out there. Some of them have really good reputations, most of them do, but there's some that are not so reputable. And that's where we have to screen some of those coming through the door for our tribal council and for others here. So I hope that helped you.
All right, Anton or Kala, anything to add? Okay. All right, so much more conversation to be had. Really appreciate the sharing of this conversation, and I think it tees us up nicely for this afternoon's discussion of we'll kind of broadly call engaged, informed, and included community as one topic for us to dive into of many. So let's take a break, bio break, stretch your legs, do what you need to do. Let's come back at 1:20 and be actually ready to start at 1:20. And we'll be spending the rest of the afternoon kind of diving into some more conversations with each other. So I see a lot of appreciation coming through on the chat, a lot of hand clapping, virtual hand clapping. So let's just do a round of applause for our panelists. Real time. Thank you. And we'll see you back here at 1:20. Thanks. All right, if you can hear me, come back on video, work group members, just so I can see that we're all here. And we'll get started in a minute. Thank you. So I'm glad to see some people are sustaining themselves by having some lunch. I realize these breaks are very short and we're traversing the lunch hour. So yeah, just a good reminder for everybody to make sure you take care of your basic needs so you can engage in these conversations and not feel the range of things that happen when we're hungry. So just to set this up, and I hope those folks who are worker members can hear me, and we'll try to get you oriented quickly so that we can get you into some conversation with each other. So we're gonna break you out into small groups. We have these assigned, and what we did was assign a coordinating committee member to each of the groups. 2 coordinating committee members might show up in the same room, but that's because we don't have as many groups as there are members of that group. So between that crew, if you could please be responsible for being the spokesperson to do the report out at the end of the small group conversation. Definitely engage in the discussion, but also if you could add on just a willingness to kind of be a spokesperson for your small group and or delegate it. If you want to delegate it, you can try to delegate it to someone else in your small group. But I would just ask that the default is that a coordinating committee member will hold that responsibility for your small group. Jenna is going to pop into the chat a Google form. And that will be an option for you to track notes. So if you want to ask someone to be taking notes or tracking notes, our staff group will also try to join as many of the groups as we can to help take some notes for you all. But we'll be staying out of the way for your conversation. So we won't be guiding you or directing you other than just this initial instruction that I'm going to be offering to the group up front. So to preface this, there's a range of issues. If you're looking at the whole system, and Tom really sort of set this up as the bigger arc even of just planning. It's planning and moving to actionable, moving to implementation and adaptive management, if you will. But there's a starting place, right? And, this may be one of the foundational pieces that we have heard resoundingly is a big thing, which is around engaged, informed, included community and what that actually means. And so what we'd like you to do is go into an exploratory conversation with each other about that. And the 3 questions that we're asking around this particular element are, why is it important? So just talk with each other about why it even matters to have an informed, included, engaged community. What are the qualities, attributes, or characteristics, or even conditions for that as you see it, and exchange in that conversation? And then finally, is there a specific role or responsibility that the state should play in this piece? Whether that's support role, whether that's quality assurance, whether that's funding, whether that's, there may be a range of different roles or responsibilities, but what, if any, specific role do you think the state might need to play in this piece? It's but a piece of the puzzle. It's not obviously the whole puzzle, but we want to start somewhere, and we know that this is a big topic. It had the most comments from your last conversation. in the previous April session. You heard a lot about it from the tribal panel today. We heard a lot about it in our assessment leading up to this process as well. So I don't want to put a lot of definition on that. That's really your job, is to say, how would we define this? But I think maybe start from a place of, why is it important? And so maybe we'll put that into our Google form. Yeah, Jenna's got it in there. And then we'll invite you to go into Breakout for 30 to 40 minutes, chat, talk, explore, and then share back out with the large group when we bring you back what you found. And Jenna's got that going. Should we have people? Okay, people are going to go, I guess. Kimberly had a question. Sorry, Kimberly, before you go, what was your question? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, my question was, there's this question about the state role, and I feel like we still haven't defined the scope per se of what we're doing, because some of these planning processes could be like, for instance, the state updating basin plans, in which case the state would need to lead that. So I feel like there's different levels to that question. So,
okay, great.
I can bring that up later.
Okay, thank you. All right, and I'll hold back and see if you don't know how to get into your group or you aren't assigned, we'll help you get in. And for those of you that are watching, you're welcome to just take a break, and we'll be back in a little while, and you'll have an opportunity to hear the report out from these small groups. So just bear with us, hang tight, and there'll be some reporting out soonish. All right, so Bob, should we just move him? Donna, are you with us?
Hey, Jenna or Robin? Hello? Jenna? Hey, I got dropped and then I got put back in, but into the wrong group. Could you get me back into 3? Thanks.
Did anyone else hear a clock ticking? Because that.
That was my fault, Director Byler. This is Kristen Rivard. I have to drive somewhere and it's my turn signal. I didn't realize I wasn't on mute. So
Did you think our time was running out?
I was starting to feel stressed out. I didn't know why.
I thought Pink Floyd was going to start playing.
All right.
If you want, I can throw my vinyl on. We can play a little time right now. Might liven things up here.
Is JR giving us a concert? I missed the whole intro to this.
I think my DJing.
My generation, I'm trying to keep vinyl alive. So
Vinyl outsells CDs now, I think.
I was gonna say, I feel it's like a generational cliche about vinyl, not like not like the opposite.
Some of us have lots of vinyl. I hate to tell you that.
You notice nobody ever brings back 8-tracks though.
And they actually were pretty good from an audio perspective, but they were just pretty clunky.
All right. Well,
Let's make sure we work this discussion into our summary.
That's right. We're gonna, one sidebar debate is gonna be on the merits of the various technologies. One could very well argue the merits of vinyl as the supreme technology. So that's a topic for another day. What I want to observe is everyone is smiling that I can see. So that's good. That's good. Glad to see that. And I think some of our groups are still making their way back, or are we all back? Okay. So if you can, and you're a work group member, if you can turn your screen on, and we're going to invite each of the 5 groups to do a 5-minute max report out of your findings of your conversation. So I want to just put a little bit of we love the sidebar. We love setting sidebars for ourselves. The sidebar is, or the parameter is, we're not judging ideas in this conversation. We're exploring ideas. So it's very generative in nature, as opposed to, splicing things out for their good or bad or ugly or otherwise. So, cassette tapes, vinyl, it's all good in this conversation. And then the other thing, I think we maybe were remiss in setting a little bit of a working assumption going into this conversation. And I think we might need to do that in this moment. Tom, you and I had a chat about this, and I'd love for you to just offer up, some of the way that you kind of phrase it to me, which I thought was actually a helpful kind of a little bit of a parameter for what are we talking about when we're talking about this regional planning construct. And some of the, if we're going to talk about essential elements, do they show up in every single planning endeavor, or what are the parameters around that?
Yeah,
looking at the elements.
There's a lot in that, but one way that I think about it that at least helps me think this through a little bit is this connection between the state and our role and any community that wants to do planning. And in particular, if the state is going to provide resources to help that planning effort, to me, that kind of suggests that, like with any grant or loan program or whether the legislature is doing direct appropriations, there's usually some standards or criteria that they would be looked at in order to make that investment, right? And so from that standpoint, when I think about regional planning, I don't think in a very prescriptive manner. I don't think that there's my personal view is that not to kind of bring out the cookie cutter and have very bright lines, but I think there may be elements or criteria or attributes of a planning effort that this group could identify that could help guide state investment in those planning efforts going forward. And so to me, that opens up a lot of opportunity for a conversation, but it also allows for some flexibility and latitude in terms of what a planning effort might look like, provided if it's going to be state funded, that it has attributes that that clear the bar in terms of what the state investments would require. And I think that's something that this group could help inform. I don't know if that was helpful, Robin.
Well, it depends on if it's helpful to the group, but I felt like that was an assumption that maybe we needed to make explicit, that when we're talking about these elements, what are some of these kind of standards, if you will? It's really tied to, if the state is going to invest resources, are there some specifics or essentials that need to present in those planning efforts? Not to say that there aren't a lot of other forms of planning that happen out there in the world, but we're talking really specifically to those that are tied to kind of the state investing in its resources to support in otherwise, fund or otherwise resource. So with that kind of working assumption, let's hear from the groups. And now let's say 3 to 5 minutes for popping out your highlights. We will share the running list of notes with everybody as well. And our team will take it and try to kind of synthesize it into something maybe categorically kind of easy to read through. But I'd love to just start with the why question. Why is this important? What did your groups come up with? And we'll just start with whoever was going to be the spokesperson for group one. And if you want to take three or so minutes to share your findings.
I'll take the effort in synthesizing our findings, and Kelly was nice enough to take notes, and she's polishing those up in the group doc, which everybody will have. So I won't read all of that. We had a good discussion on all these elements. It was very easy for us all to agree that water is important to everyone, and it's important to bring everybody to the table on a level playing field and be proactive in how we take these conversations on, so that it's not a crisis-driven endeavor. And the hope would be that by building a shared understanding around water issues and developing greater understanding and supporting community engagement, then we'll have better outcomes. So that was what we had for the why it's important. I don't know if other groups, other members want to chime in on that. No. Okay.
And then maybe we'll skip down to the question of, did you have thoughts about what, if any, specific role the state might play?
The meat of the work here. So the thoughts we had on the state role is, well, one, we all agree that the state should have a role in some fashion, but that needs to be tailored for each planning effort. Some of the key areas are ensuring that there is funding to support the efforts, capacity building, bringing in specialists, that sort of effort. And then related but separate is also assisting with data, providing existing data, helping identify data gaps, sharing data, encouraging interagency coordination, and having technical experts available to participate when requested by these planning efforts. And one of the other aspects is that the state could help by continuing, by supporting the efforts, facilitation, outreach, communication, making sure that folks feel like they're engaged, as we talked about, as being important. The state could help by providing some sort of structure and providing guidance on how such efforts might go forward.
Great, thank you. All right, let's move on to group two. We'll start with the why question.
I will start out our conversation. Well, why? Because without water, we're not going to get very far no matter what we do. We kind of looked at the question a little differently as to why we needed to bring all of the players to the table in order to achieve a good ending, a good proposal. And of course, that's because everybody has a different perspective and use for water. So we need all the key players to be involved, and you need a strong leader or facilitator to manage the process. And you need to have some incentives for folks. So crew, chime in.
Maybe I'd weigh in just briefly to say that, in very simple terms, it's strategic and practical to include as many people as possible, because you've got the interests represented that live in and have interest in the community that the plan relates to, and that could avoid conflict or opposition to any planning effort down the line. And I think the other kind of general comment was that the more perspectives you bring to the table, at least the opportunity for a better informed and better plan will result.
Great. What about the question of the state role or?
Well, yes, we thought that there certainly was a role for the state. We want them to send us endless funds, and we talked about a process similar to the Watershed Council process, development of a funding source, or a state funding source from from the citizens, perhaps like the Watershed Council process. So the state is extremely important in moving this forward for capacity and funding. Kate, Kathleen?
Sure, I'll tag on to that, Margaret. Agree with all that. We also said that there was an important role for providing a skilled and neutral facilitator. These aren't easy problems, and we're going to need some support in moving through them. We also spent a little bit of time talking about, what is the backdrop or the regulatory or policy, or why should people do this, right? We can think in a lot of regions where you have the right people, the right motivation, and they would probably embrace an opportunity if there was support and funding available, and they would probably embrace that opportunity and engage and move forward. They said there's other places in the state where folks wouldn't. They'd say, why should I come to that table? I have no interest in that. I'm doing quite well myself, and I think I might be asked to give up something if I went to that table. So what is the state backdrop? What if folks aren't motivated to come to the table and find better solutions? What, if any, are the consequences that would motivate somebody to come together with the other components in their community and recognize that water is a universal need, and that we have to work together to create better solutions than we have. So we're hoping the rest of you have the answer to that question, but we felt we articulated the question well, and we could just turn it over to you from there.
That's great. And Bob, did you have something to add for the group?
There was just a question as to whether, there were other successful processes from other states that we could learn from. So I think it was an important question that was asked. And certainly from the standpoint too, like, you give us hope that we can get through this process and find a collaborative solution that works for as best it can for all parties involved.
Great. All right. Thank you, group 2. Group 3.
Yeah, so we had a little bit more kind of free form discussion, but I think some important themes came out that can answer questions 1 and 2. And for question 1, the why, I think one of the things that stands out most to me was talking about the why from a timing perspective, that it's important to build relationships and trust early, preferably before a process starts, because that takes pressure off the process and helps people to hold kind of the relationships that are necessary as part of readiness. That you need data to start a process and have your baseline, but you also need a relationship baseline, and to know like who's missing from the table as well if they're not part of the existing Relationships. And Nikki and our group talked a lot too about the benefit of capacity that can come from different processes. A process she was part of related to FERC and hydropower on the Clackamas River, that it set the stage to have like the information, knowledge, and relationships for other processes. So not thinking about things in a siloed way as just we're doing it for this one thing, but that it builds capacity and relationships and trust that can be useful in other spaces if managed well. And then in terms of the role of the state, one of the things that came up early in the conversation was providing guidance and best practices. When the state is like directly initiating a process or giving funding, that can be part of expectations for the process. And when it's not necessarily state directed or supported in that kind of financial sense, still providing like a guide document that provides guidance and best practices for how to do this work, especially for under-resourced communities. We also talked about the importance, as other groups have, of funding and just resourcing people to be at the table, but that's a really big challenge for certain stakeholders and for some communities. So having sustainable resources from the table can help provide support. And then the last key piece that stands out to me related to the state is just around measurement and reporting, that can be really valuable for people from a progress and transparency perspective to set a baseline of data and in information and provide resources for the education and capacity building that are necessary throughout the process. And then the last piece that we were talking about as we wrapped up was just that the state actually has legal responsibilities around basin planning that need to come into play, and its role is factored in from that perspective as well. It's not just what does it do to support community engagement, but also that it has this legal authority that should not be forgotten. And I'll pause there to see if any group members want to share anything that I forgot or reframe anything that didn't feel like it reflected our conversation.
All right, I see a thumbs up from Kala. All right, thank you, Oriana and group 3. Let's go to group 4.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, my internet is being a little shaky, so I'm on my phone, so I apologize. Okay, so first question, we talked about the fact that having more folks at the table ultimately creates a sense of ownership in that community. So having people at the table to which that process will impact is extremely important. Creates trust and builds longevity into the planning process. And with more people at the table, it's a lot easier to get information back out into the broader community as well. We also talked about the fact that more people at the table means the more information you have about that area. So everyone will have different pieces of information to add to the discussion. And that ultimately makes the planning process a lot more robust. We also talked about the fact that having more folks at the table and having that community very well informed and engaged leads to less litigation or being less likely to see litigation in that area. If no one is excluded, it makes for better overall product. For defining attributes, we also agreed that there needs to be a skilled facilitator to work amongst the various interests, data from various state agency for that region that can speak to demand, available supply, water quality, et cetera. And then we also got into a conversation about kind of this balance between local versus state interests. So we talked about wanting to make sure there's strong local engagement, but there are statewide groups, not necessarily agencies, who should also be engaged. So various perspectives on that correct balance between those interests and whether they are distinct interests is really important. We talked about making sure there's tribal engagement, of course, and that the state government isn't the biggest interest, but it should be present. And last two things there, we talked about transparency and accountability are critical attributes for an informed community. and then metrics as a way to know what's being accomplished and what still needs work. And then as far as the state role, we think that there needs to be some sideboards from the state on what that informed and engaged community looks like. But ultimately, it should be up to the community to make sure the community is informed and engaged. So the state could perhaps provide, a list of the broad types of groups that should be included and definitions for those groups. And then, the group itself can make sure that the state agrees that the right people are at the table and the groups are represented. I'll pause there and ask Peggy or Daniel, or I know Lily was listening into our group as well, if I missed anything.
All right, thumbs up from at least one member of the group. Thank you, Holly. Great job from Daniel. Group 5.
Hey, this is Kaylin Barter from Wild Salmon Center. I'm just going to start out and say we had a very free-form conversation, and it was really great. So diving right in, I think we all agreed inclusive planning builds trust. Acknowledging that water planning, JR used the term multi-biennial and multi-generational. So making the process inclusive is critical to preventing, again, another JR term, end-arounders from undoing it when you get to the end. 2 important pieces that were highlighted is the foundational understanding of the framework that you're working within, and then making sure that there's the capacity for long-term engagement. Durability was one of the themes that came up again and again, both in terms of the capacity of members to engage over time, but also how the plan itself is going to be adaptively managed once it's developed, and setting out, what are the metrics for success, who's responsible for tracking those. I think part of the prompt was engaged and informed and included communities. And it seems like this one prompt is the whole nut of regional water planning. So I think that's where we ended up talking, was all of what does state-supported regional planning look like?
This is part of it for you all.
Yeah, defining what is your goal, what is and who's the community that you're trying to serve and that you're needing to include in planning around it. It can be really difficult to have the information that you need from the beginning to come up with what your objectives and your metrics are going to be. So having some flexibility in terms of not making the perfect the enemy of the good, understanding what data do you fundamentally need, what analysis do you fundamentally need, but how are you going to move forward in the face of uncertainty, knowing that you're not ever going to have exactly what you want. Jennifer raised, she said it so well, and I wanted to make sure I say it right here. Choosing, give me just not acting in the absence of information can be an action in and of itself. So understanding that we can't wait another 10 years to get started on water planning on these key issues. There's so much more here in the notes, but I think timing was another piece that we talked about in terms of defining the community. For some of these shorter term project-based elements, it might make sense for community to be smaller in terms of the list of people. Bobby made the point, invite everybody and be as inclusive as you can. But if you're looking at some of these longer term planning processes, then it comes up to the basin level and potentially the state level. And then JR highlighted some that bring in international level, like in the Columbia Basin. State role, just to jump to that, data and analysis, implementation support, how to bridge the biennial cycle of funding and show sustained commitment. having WRD and ODF and W and other state agencies at the table to be able to have that bi-directional flow of information. I'm gonna, gosh, you guys, there's so much in here, but I'm gonna pause and see if other members of our conversation want to pile on there or clarify rather.
You did great, Kaylin.
Good job, Kaylin. I think we're just scratching the surface of a much deeper, dare I say, well of conversation and material here. But I think this was, our intention really was to help you all just kind of start to get into this conversation, and maybe others of you are seeing or maybe reflect what Group 5 reflected, which is this is one of the hearts of this conversation is the ensuring and empowering engaged and informed communities to share in the ownership of setting water future for all, and that there's a state role in supporting that. I think that's one of the big questions that we're trying to tease out here is what assurances, what supports, what resources does the state need to bring to bear to ensure that these groups can be effective in the work that they're doing. Got a lot of chit chat about the process format around breakout groups. So if we need to do a little evaluation of that, we can, but I'd love to actually move us on to talking about what's coming next, because we've got a big in-person gathering set up for your next together, which is June 7th. More of this type of conversation, but there's a whole world of other elements and kind of some maybe even broader conversation around those other spaces that Tom was talking about today, which is kind of that developing plans into actionable and then implementing those actions, and where are there may be pieces of that part of the system that could use some improvement or modernization, and also getting to the why of that. I think part of what your challenge is to articulate the why. And so we'll keep coming back to that as a starting place for these discussions. So just to kind of tee up a little bit for June, we have reserved, not yet, but we're getting really close to reserving. We have a couple options that we're floating for the Bend area. It'll definitely be in Bend, okay. And we're gonna organize for a 10 to 3, basically a workshopping kind of session, work session for all of you to get together and kind of continue to explore these conversations that are tied to the elements and pieces of the system. We will be tacking on as an opt-in. We'll tack on maybe a happy hour after that. And we might even be inviting folks who want to stay over to join us on a field tour of some sort the next day. That's like the least of what we've had planned out yet, but that's another option too. But we really see the value of you all getting together in person. We're reflecting that on your behalf because many of you have said that to us and to each other. So we're really, really hopeful that you can make the time and be there. We have resources to support you. So your travel expenses will be paid for. We can cover lodging. We'll cover a couple of meals. We'd love to just be able to fully support you and being able to get together. If you can, the only thing we can't give you back is your time. So you have to decide that it's time well spent. And that's the other thing that we'll commit to is helping this, build some sort of a space for you for it to be time well spent. But it's really your time that you need to decide is important enough to be there. And it will take, travel and extra time. And so we recognize that that's a little beyond what happens when we get just popping onto the Zoom space. But we really hope everybody can make it. I know already that there's at least one person who would have troubles getting there in person. And so I want to just kind of float the option if it feels viable to any of you at this stage of the game. If you feel like you need to or could send an alternate, that might be an option. We're not getting into like deliberative decision-making space yet. So it feels still okay if folks need to kind of have a proxy attend on your behalf or on behalf of your organization or entity that you're representing. Obviously, we would prefer our primary members to be there, but if you can't, that's maybe one alternative option. We will look into the possibility of providing some kind of a virtual option in. Clearly, that's not ideal, and given we don't know exactly what the all the AV and everything that's available to us in the space, because we haven't confirmed the space yet, we'll have to work with that. But I'm just putting that out there for you all because I want to both entice you and get you excited to come together. And we'll give you some food and drinks and coffee for sure. And also we're happy to coordinate and help with like carpooling arrangements if people need to like carpool or do those kinds of things. We're happy to also assist with that piece. And we'll work with the coordinating committee to kind of further develop out just the plan for that day. We also just want to say that there's some folks have still a desire to do some additional learning opportunities. And we'd like to make sure that we create some channels for that. And so to the extent that there's a need from the group to say, we actually want to learn a little bit more about this, or there are some resources out there that really could come to bear on what we're talking about. Let's pull those resources in as we need them. And if any of you are so compelled to set up some side kind of conversations of learning, we can support you in that. And we can even have those recorded. So if people aren't all able to show up to that, at least we'd have a recording and people would have that as a resource or reference to you. A couple that we've heard from of kind of particular and repeated desire is, what are other states doing? So let's maybe tailor that to what are other states doing related to whatever topics we're talking about in this space. So that's one. And Kaylin, you have expressed a willingness to maybe help us think through that and maybe even provide a little leadership on that. We won't throw you all the way into that yet, but the other one was around like watershed councils and the network of watershed councils. We've had some preliminary conversations with that network, and they have a couple of already established forum places. We're working with Kelly and the group there. So if there's an interest in learning a little bit about the watershed council network and kind of the history of that, or how that works, or even some of the funding mechanisms around that, we can set something up on the side for that. The third one we heard pretty repeatedly was around this Water Futures Network and the Water Futures Forum, and sort of some of the water justice policy ideas and engagement that's been happening within that network. So we're also kind of leaning into that to see if we might be able to establish some kind of a presentation or an exchange for the Water Futures group with this group. There may be others. Feel free to come forward with those to me or Jenna, and we'll just kind of ask us to think about how they relate to and our value add to this work group in the time that you have together, and then we'll help organize those. So just want to put that out there as supplemental stuff. And we may even follow up today with, here's a couple of resources that might be well worth your time to read and look into before you get together in June. That might tee you up for a little more informed conversation along the way. That was quite a bit, but I just wanted to get that process point out there. April.
Yeah, I waited until you were done, Robin. So a few thoughts. One, in looking at the proposed work plan, it would seem that we'll have an in-person meeting in June, and then the July and August meetings would be virtual, and then potentially we would have an in-person meeting in September. And I get that we won't know what happens after that, but I would just ask that if we're going to have an in-person meeting, that the calendar invites reflect that with a time that allows. So for example, this meeting that we're having in June, I've had it on my calendar since we started. I've reserved that time, but it was starting at 11 o'clock. And if I'm traveling over to Bend, I will be able to do this one because I gave that feedback to Jenna, and, scheduling it at 10, that allows for that. But I think just recognizing, I don't know about y'all, but going back to in-person meetings, while it's wonderful, accounting for that additional travel time that it takes to get there and back, I think is an important factor for us to be able to, I'm committed to being part of this process, and I want to, but in recognizing that extra time that it may take to get to the location where we're going to be, I think it'll be important to update those calendar invites as soon as we start going along that. And similarly for the post events and things like that, the further advance notice we have, the more that we can plug that into our schedule. And then unrelated to that, but related to one of your other points, I'm still more than willing, and one of our work group members has taken me up on the offer to go out and look at irrigation district stuff or learn more about ag water suppliers. We got entities all over the state, and I'm happy to help put something together as informal as you might like that. So that's all I
Great.
have.
Great. Thank you. All right. Let me just check my notes, make sure I didn't miss anything from our wrap up. Yeah, I appreciate actually kind of flexing some old muscles of getting together in person. The time, like carving out the time, figuring out like logistics. I mean, even that's been like, oh yeah, we haven't done that for 2.5 years. So we have to kind of get our heads around that. But also just, like how does it feel to get in the room together? And I think that might tell you all and tell us how often you want to make the time to get together in person. We just put it out there as, let's try to do this at least a couple times while we're meeting. So September seemed like a logical next stop, but absolutely, if the group is so moved to get together in person, we're happy to continue on that track with you all and just try to do it with, as minimal disruption to the rest of your lives as possible. But it is, it's a commitment. It's a commitment that everybody has to decide or decide is sort of worth it. And that's part of the work here is for you all to kind of figure out what's the there for you to be in this space. And we'll just keep supporting you in that. I want to just again thank the presenters who have presented today and in the past, and really kind of teeing up some of the foundational stuff for your conversations. But there's more. So if we want to bring in more, let's do that as it relates to your work. And please feel free to reach out to our team or the coordinating committee members if you have specific agenda ideas or topical ideas that you want to make sure we bring into this process. But as it stands, we'll kind of keep moving on that track with these elements and looking at some of the, sort of those 3 phases of the planning, which is planning, project development, if you will, project being that broad term that Peggy helped us see, and then also implementation. Where in the system are improvements needed, and what advice do you all want to give back to the state around those things? So thank you everybody for your attention and really leaning into the discussions today. We'll follow up with some notes. We'll follow up with some more specifics and logistics around the June meeting. And then just let us know if for whatever reason you just simply can't make it. We'll try to figure out how to accommodate an alternative for you. And with that, any closing thoughts from Tom or I guess our representatives are still on the line as well.
I'll jump in just to say thanks, everyone. Thought it was a really productive discussion. I think we all started to see the juices flowing a little bit, and I really look forward to our upcoming meeting. I think it'll be fun to see everyone in person and to be able to really roll up our sleeves and wrestle with these interesting issues. So I appreciate hearing everyone's those subgroups that we had. I thought were there was good energy in all of them, and it appeared, which is a really neat thing. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Anything from our representatives?
Nothing to add on my end. Yep, we're still here and but can't add much to this great conversation today. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all. And we'll give you 5 minutes back of your time and really look forward to catching up with y'all soon. Bye.